Bilateral ties in the meantime between the United States and South Africa is set to be strengthened. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has arrived in South Africa. Washington, D.C. seeks to reset its engagement with the continent. Blinken's visit comes just after the Russian Foreign Affairs Minister Sergei Lavrov's visit to the continent. SABC News reporter Kailisha Kumalo is on the story and he's in Soweto. A very good afternoon to you, KK. Thanks indeed for joining us. So talk to us about the significance of this visit by the US Secretary of State to South Africa.
Well, absolutely, Criselda. It's quite important because we do know that America really is trying to reset its foreign policy in the continent. For the longest time, you look at the very controversial period of One America policy where everything was really centralized during the Trump administration. A lot of opportunities were missed, and this is quite important. And I mean, obviously, happens right after we saw the Russian Federation Foreign Affairs Minister Sergei Lavrov was right here in the continent as well, having a charm offensive, trying to interact with the continent. But to look at the very significance of Mr. Blinken's visit here in South Africa, we're joined by our very own international editor, SOPHIE MOKOENA. So, Sophie, let us look at the importance of this visit. I mean, we do know that they describe this relationship as very cordial, as very complex at times, because how Pretoria and Washington, D.C. will interpret things. Sometimes they're not on the very same page. But why is it so key now?
It is quite important to know that South Africa post-1994 did strengthen its relations with the United States of America. When you go back to former President Nelson Mandela, he had sound relationship with former President Bill Clinton, and later on W. Bush, former President Mbeki. They did have a relationship, even though at times there were challenges, particularly when you look at what transpired in Iraq, where South Africa was firm that what the United States of America and the UK was up to before invading Iraq was just not on, but they continued to have that sound relationship. And then later, of course, during Obama, you know that the then Secretary of State, John Kerry, had a sound relationship with our former international relations minister. And of course, only during Donald Trump, where, as you pointed out, that the relations were not that sound. We didn't see Mike Pompeo visiting South Africa at all. But now here we are, Antony Blinken in the country, in the southern region. Generally, people interpreting this visit as part of strengthening the relations not only with South Africa but with the southern region. As you know, that South Africa is a gateway to the southern region but also generally to the continent. And from here he will be going to the DRC. You know that the DRC, it is the incoming chair of the SADC region, and therefore I think it's critical to also meet with the leadership of the DRC, particularly at the time where the DRC is experiencing lots of challenges in terms of security. You know, America is involved on the continent in trying to assist to maintain peace, even though other people are saying it's not only about peace, but it is also about the U.S. interest.
But a very sacred space where we are. We're just talking off air that quite a number of high-profile leaders, whenever they come to South Africa, they always want to see Soweto. I mean, this is the face of resistance. You look at the young people in 1976. How critical is it that we are standing right here in these hallowed walls where the young people took it upon themselves, and obviously the support, and also just how the anti-apartheid movement had this global profile, but just the meaning why we're here today?
Well, you know that many high-profile leaders around the world, influential people, ordinary people, when we arrived here, we saw many people who are tourists, who are moving around the Vilakazi Street, and of course some of them will end up here. You know that this is a very sacred place in terms of the transformation of this country and the liberation of this country. Those young children in Soweto who led the way in ensuring that they bring down the might of the apartheid regime, and then they were the people really who ensure that we are where we are, much as we had different position or different eras in terms of the struggle, but the 1976 was just a turning point where thousands of children in Soweto, some outside Soweto in other provinces, took to the streets, and at that time it was all about the language of the oppressor, Africans then, and them saying enough is enough and we're not gonna continue, we are going to the streets. And of course supported by those who were outside the country, and many of them fled to neighboring countries. Today some of them are ministers, they're holding influential position in different societies. Some of them, of course, it is a question whether they are, indeed it is the fact that they are the forgotten, but really the Soweto struggle will not be erased in the calendar of the world. And many people, when they come here, they want to touch base with that historic perspective to remind themselves where South Africa comes from, and particularly the Democrats, when they are in power in the United States of America. We've seen all their leaders coming here to really pay homage to those young people who perished here in Soweto, particularly Hector Peterson, as you can see in that picture. And but the sad story of Mbuyiselo, who is still not known where his remains are, or where he perished, or whether he's still alive. And therefore these are the issues that many people want to touch base with and to remind themselves where South Africa is right now, and indeed a very painful history.
And quite a very busy day for the Secretary of State Blinken and his counterpart Minister Pandor. Tomorrow, that strategic partnership. We know that when you talk about US and South Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, the continent, the issue of AGOA, the beneficial trade pact. Do you think those are some of the issues that will feature prominently tomorrow once these two leaders meet?
Indeed, currently when you look at South Africa's paper on South Africa's interest in terms of the international relations, you were there when they were launching that paper. It looks at the interest of South Africa, and trade is quite central. You know that currently high on the agenda of international relations, it's economic diplomacy, and even the representatives of South Africa around the world, the main issue right now is how you ensure that you build better relations, trade relations for South Africa at this critical time where our country is experiencing economic challenges, and therefore you really have to find a way to bring in the investors, and you have to build such relationships based on the sound political relationship and the issue of security. And therefore the issue of trade and investment will also feature high in the agenda of the two leaders, or during the talks of the two leaders tomorrow. And perhaps tomorrow in the afternoon, when the Secretary of State unpack the policies of the United States of America directed at Africa, both looking at security, political, and also economical, will get a clearer sense in terms of what is the vision or perhaps the mission of Blinken in South Africa, by extension on the continent.
And undoubtedly the elephant in the room will be the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Pretoria and Washington DC, they not really seem to be finding each other on that point, especially around that bill that is before the Congress. The African countries working with Russia who may be punished, and we spoke to Dr. Pandor. She was so clear that she'll be seeking some clarity. So I suppose that's going to be a very major issue in this regard.
Well, South Africa and the United States of America are good friends, but at times there are issues where they don't agree. It's not the first time. I made an example of the war in Ukraine, the example of the war in Iraq during Beggy Bush era and Mandela weighing in, and you also had another terrible chapter with Libya, the invasion of Libya during Zuma and Obama era. And therefore now again we have a situation where you have this war in Ukraine, South Africa saying all parties must come together and talk, but the United States of America seeing the Russians as aggressors, and therefore they must be punished, and anyone doing business with them must also be punished. And that is why South Africa is raising this issue to say, but how can you do that? You can't dictate who our friends should be. That's exactly what Madiba told many leaders around the world when his relationship with the Cuban leader was questioned, when they questioned him about his relationship with Gaddafi and China and many others, and Russia. And therefore South Africa is firm in terms of no one will dictate to South Africa who South Africa's friends should be. And I think during these discussions, this issue is going to really dominate the talks, that how dare you decide to pass a bill that is going to punish many African countries who are doing business with Russia. So let's see, we'll hear from the Secretary of State perhaps tomorrow after the meeting when they talk about this issue, but I can tell you now, this is one issue that they are not going to agree.
All right. Sophie, thank you so much indeed for that insight. Of course, our very own international editor here, the SABC, quite a lot expected during the course of the visit by the U.S. Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, and of course, he'll also be heading to the DRC and of course, Rwanda as well. So it's going to be a very busy one for him, especially because he just got back from Southeast Asia, where he was engaging as well with other partners. So with that, back to you, Griselda.
Khayelitsha Khumalo, as well as SABC international news editor Sophie MOKOENA, out there in Soweto, where the U.S. Secretary of State is expected to visit the Hector Peterson Memorial there.